The wind came from the north that morning, which was ordinary. What was not ordinary was the smell inside it. Marin Calloway stood at the highest point of her 3 acres at the crest of the south-facing slope, where the grass had already gone the color of old bone, and she breathed in slowly through her nose, the way her mother had taught her to breathe when the earth was trying to tell you something important. The cold had arrived early this year, ahead of schedule by 2 weeks at least, and the men in town had spoken of it the way they spoke of most inconveniences as a thing to be managed, complained about, and ultimately endured. They were not wrong about endurance. They were wrong about almost everything else. The smell was iron and dry stone, and something beneath both of those, something older and harder to name, like the inside of a root cellar that had been sealed for a generation. Marin had spent 35 years learning not to trust that smell. She had spent 35 years becoming the kind of woman a town like Harrow's Crossing found acceptable. Quiet, useful, unremarkable. And part of that work had been the steady, deliberate suppression of everything her mother had pressed into her before the fever took her in the spring of 1861. The smell made that work feel thin. It made 35 years feel like a single afternoon. She was 24 years old the last time the air carried this particular cold. The year was 1839, and she was living 40 miles east of where she stood now in a settlement that no longer existed because there was no one left to maintain it. Her father's house had been the finest in that settlement, 2 full stories, a real glass window facing west, a cast iron stove imported from Cincinnati at considerable expense. He had been proud of that house in the way men are proud of things that cost them something and look impressive from the road. When the storm came, the house had lasted 4 days before the cold broke through every wall, simultaneously filling the rooms with a creeping patient frost that moved like water finding its level. Her father had died on the 5th day, her elder brother on the 6th. 3 neighboring families went in the days that followed one by one like candles in a draft. She had not died because her mother dragged her fighting and weeping into the earth. Marin's mother, Evening Star, was Mandan, and she had built the shelter in September of that year without telling Marin's father what she was doing. She had described it as a root cellar extension when he asked which was close enough to the truth that he hadn't pressed the matter. It was not a root cellar. It was 8 feet deep, lined with field stone on the north wall, roofed with salvaged timber and 3 feet of packed earth with 2 salvaged window frames set into the south-facing slope at a precise angle her mother had explained with her hands more than her words. The angle catches the sun when the sun is lowest, she had said, pressing her palm flat and tilting it toward the horizon. The earth holds what the sun gives. The stone holds what the earth keeps. The family keeps what the stone remembers. Marin had thought at 24 that her mother was being poetic. She understood now that her mother had been being precise. She stood on the hill and breathed the iron smell and did the arithmetic she had been avoiding since mid-September. The sandhill cranes had moved south 3 weeks earlier than any year she could remember, and she had watched their formations from the same hillside with a feeling she could not yet articulate, the way you feel in the moment before you understand bad news, when your body knows before your mind catches up. The beaver dam on the creek south of town was deeper this year by nearly a foot, reinforced with a density of material she had never seen in 35 years of walking that creek. The frost line, when she pushed a metal rod into the ground the last week of October, met resistance at 6 inches in a year that should have had another month before the ground locked that hard. She was not reading omens. She was reading data. Her mother had taught her the difference, and she had spent decades being careful to honor it. The town meeting was that evening. She had known about it for 2 weeks and had spent those 2 weeks deciding whether to speak. The decision had not come easily. She had been invisible in Harrow's Crossing for most of the 11 years since her husband Thomas had died of a fever, and invisibility had its uses. It kept you from being wrong in public. It kept you from having to watch men's faces move through the particular sequence. Polite attention, mild skepticism, barely concealed condescension that they produced when a woman said something they found inconvenient. She had watched that sequence performed on other women, younger women mostly, and she had noted the way it left marks on them even when they held their ground. She was 62 years old. She had stopped worrying about marks a long time ago. What she had not stopped worrying about was being right when no one listened. That was a different kind of mark. That was the kind that did not fade. The Harrow's Crossing town hall smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, and the particular confidence of men who have not recently been wrong about anything significant. Marin arrived early enough to take a seat in the last row, which she preferred for reasons she did not examine too closely. The back row allowed her to watch the whole room at once, to see who sat next to whom, who leaned toward whom to whisper, who kept their eyes forward, and who let them wander. A room told you things if you watched it the way you watched a river, paying attention to currents rather than surface. The room was nearly full by the time Alderman Chester Prescott took his position at the front, and it was the kind of full that felt satisfied with itself. Harrow's Crossing had 412 residents at the last count, and the majority of the adults had turned out tonight, which was a measure of the communal anxiety the early cold had generated, and also of their faith that the anxiety would be addressed. Prescott was a large man, not tall but broad, with the physical presence of someone accustomed to filling doorways and conversations equally. He had been alderman for 15 years and had the manner of a man who had learned to mistake familiarity for wisdom. He spoke well. That was the difficulty with Prescott. He was genuinely good at the mechanics of public reassurance. He hit the right notes in the right order, building from acknowledgement of the cold to historical precedent to specific concrete action, arriving at the figure of Silas Holt with the timing of a man who has rehearsed the sequence. Holt ran the largest lumber operation in 2 counties, a lean man with a face like weathered fence board and eyes that moved with a merchant's constant calculation. He rose when Prescott gestured to him, confirmed the doubled cordwood commitment with the ease of a man confirming something he has already decided, and sat back down. What neither of them mentioned, and what Marin noticed because she had learned to notice what men leave out of sentences, was the quality of the wood. She had bought 2 cords from Holt's operation in early October, the first time she had done business with him in several years, and the wood had been wet through green-cut timber that had not been given the 18 months of proper drying that turned it from an expensive fire hazard into actual fuel. Green wood burned fast and hot at first, and then smoldered, producing smoke and a fraction of the heat that seasoned hardwood generated. She had tested it because her mother had taught her to test things by touching them, by smelling them, by holding them up, and considering their density. 2 cords of Holt's wood would do the work of perhaps 1 cord of properly seasoned oak. She watched Holt's right hand move briefly to the inside pocket of his coat after he sat down, touching something there, a notebook from the rectangular shape of the movement. She did not know the specifics of his finances. She knew the gesture of a man checking a number he is trying not to think about. The room settled into the comfortable hum of a plan being received, well, the sound of people deciding that the problem has been handled and they can stop being afraid. Prescott was moving toward closure, the part where he thanked people for coming and reminded them of the town's long history of meeting difficulty with fortitude, and Marin became aware of the weight of the moment pressing against her, the way cold presses against a door, not forcing it, just making its presence known, making you understand that the door is the only thing between the inside and the outside. She stood up. The sound that followed was not silence exactly. It was the specific acoustic of a room catching itself mid-breath. Prescott's expression moved through 3 distinct phases in the span of a second: surprise, recognition, and then the settling of his features into the particular configuration men used when they were being patient with someone whose patience they expected to require. Mistress Calloway. His voice carried its own kind of weather, warm on the surface with something cooler underneath. Do you have a concern to share with the community? I have a warning. She kept her voice level and did not raise it because she had learned that women who raised their voices in rooms like this were heard as emotional rather than urgent, and she did not have time to navigate that particular misreading tonight. What has been proposed will not be enough. I am not speaking of the quantity of wood, though, that is also a problem. I am speaking of the nature of the shelter we are proposing to stay in. The room's quality of attention sharpened, which was what she had hoped for, and also what she had feared. She had it now. She had perhaps 90 seconds before she lost it to skepticism. She spoke of the signs the way her mother had taught her to speak of them, not as mystical portents, but as observable data, the kind of information that accumulated in a landscape over months and rewarded attention. The crane migration 3 weeks early, the beaver construction denser and deeper than any year in her memory, the frost line locking sooner than it should. She spoke of the temperature her metal rod had found at 6 inches and what that meant for what was coming. She spoke of 1839, not as a story, but as a reference point, the way you might cite a comparable storm to establish the scale of what she was describing. Then she described what needed to be built. The pit, 8 feet deep, south-facing slope, the thermal mass of the surrounding earth maintaining a survivable baseline temperature regardless of what the air above did. The glazed roof panel, angled to capture the winter sun low in the sky from November through February, hitting glass at 45 degrees and driving heat into the stone that lined the interior walls. The ventilation system, 2 pipes running in opposite directions using the basic physics of rising warm air to maintain circulation without losing the heat you had spent effort accumulating. The stone bench along the north wall hollow inside with the stovepipe running through its mass before exiting through the roof, a design that extracted every available calorie from a small amount of wood before letting the smoke go. She said the phrase thermal mass and watched several faces in the room process it the way faces process unfamiliar language, with a slight forward lean that was either interest or the precursor to dismissal. She could not yet tell which. The earth at 6 feet below the frost line maintains a constant temperature regardless of surface conditions, she said. Not warm, but survivable. What you cannot maintain with wood fires and frame houses against a sustained Arctic event the earth maintains without any effort at all. You are not fighting the cold, you are stepping below it. The silence that followed was not the silence of a room being persuaded. It was the silence of a room deciding how to respond to something it had already determined to reject. Prescott moved first. Mistress Calloway. Something in his tone had adjusted. The patience was still there, but thinner now, stretched over something less charitable. Are you proposing that the families of Harrow's Crossing abandon their homes and burrow into the ground? I am proposing that we build a communal shelter in the south-facing slope of the ridge, outside town, that uses the Earth's own thermal properties to maintain a survivable interior temperature, regardless of what occurs above. It is not a hole. It is an engineered structure built according to principles that have kept people alive in conditions identical to what is coming. Kept which people alive? Silas Holt's voice came from the third row. Not raised, not hostile exactly, but edged with something she recognized as the irritation of a man whose livelihood was being implicitly criticized. Because I notice you haven't mentioned whose people you're talking about. There it was. She had known it was coming, had felt it gathering in the room like weather of its own. My mother's people. She did not elaborate and did not soften it because elaboration and softening were strategies for people who had something to apologize for, and she had decided 20 minutes ago that she was done with apology. The Mandan have built Earth Lodge structures for longer than this territory has had settlers in it, and those structures have survived winters that would kill every person in this room in 3 days. That is not mysticism. That is engineering that predates our presence here by several centuries. Reverend Arthur Crane rose from the fifth row with the deliberate motion of a man who has been waiting for his moment. He was narrow everywhere, narrow face, narrow shoulders, narrow convictions, and he had the voice of someone who had practiced projecting it into spaces larger than himself. Mistress Calloway, I say this with Christian charity. The phrase landed with the weight of things said without charity. What you are describing is a retreat into the earth, a rejection of the upright structures in which God-fearing people make their homes and raise their families. There is a reason we build houses that stand. There is a reason our churches have steeples. We reach upward. That is the direction of our aspiration and our faith. In the direction of the wind, she said, which will find every gap in every steeple you build. A laugh moved through the room, quickly suppressed, and she watched Crane's narrow face absorb it with the particular dignity of a man who has decided not to acknowledge being wounded. He sat down slowly and did not look at her again. In the third row, an old man had not laughed. Emmett Shaw was 78 years old, which made him perhaps the only other person in the room with a chance of remembering 1839 with any clarity. His hands rested on his knees with the careful stillness of aged joints, and his eyes were fixed on something at an indeterminate middle distance. Not Marin, not Prescott, not the floor, but some interior landscape that only he could see. He had, when she first began speaking, done something almost imperceptible. He had nodded, once small as if to himself rather than to the room. Then he had stopped nodding and had not moved since. She looked at him for a moment longer than she looked at anyone else. She did not understand why he was silent. She understood only that his silence was a choice and that choices made from silence carried their own weight forward in time. Prescott restored order with the ease of a man who has done it often. He thanked her for her contribution. He used the word contribution the way you use it for something you are filing away rather than acting on. He reminded the room that the town had faced hard winters before and had always come through them, which was true, but which proved nothing about the winter that had not yet arrived. He called the meeting to a close with the practiced finality of someone who has learned that endings like beginnings benefit from decisiveness. Marin did not sit down when Prescott thanked her. She remained standing for a moment that lasted perhaps 4 seconds, which was long enough to make those 4 seconds felt. And then she said, without raising her voice and without directing the words at any specific person, "I will build my own then, and I will leave the door unlocked." She walked out of the town hall and the heavy oak door closed behind her with a sound like something being settled. Outside, the air had dropped another 5 degrees since she had gone in. A single snowflake landed on the back of her left hand, and she looked at it, a small, precise construction, six-sided symmetry against the skin of a 62-year-old woman who had spent 35 years not saying what she knew. She watched it dissolve. She had said it now. Whatever came next, she had said it. In the third row of the town hall, Emmett Shaw sat with his hands on his knees and did not move. In the fifth row, a young man named Gerard Holt sat very still beside the empty seat his father had just vacated and did the calculation he had been doing since Marin began speaking. Gerard was 28 years old and had spent 3 years studying structural engineering at a technical institute in Boston before his father called him back to manage the eastern accounts of the lumber operation. He understood thermal mass in the way people who have studied heat transfer understand it, not as a general concept, but as a quantifiable property measurable in BTUS and specific heat capacity and the particular density of different stone types. He understood the 45-degree angle she had described, had understood it immediately and viscerally in the way you understand something you have read about in textbooks but never seen applied. He understood the ventilation system and its elegance, the way it used natural physics instead of mechanical intervention, the way it would continue functioning without maintenance or monitoring, regardless of conditions outside. He understood, sitting very still in the fifth row of the Harrows Crossing Town Hall, that what the woman in the plain dark coat had just described would work. Not theoretically. Actually, in the ground, in the cold, in the storm, he had also noticed, building in the data of the past 2 months, the early frost, the low barometric readings, the particular opacity of the clouds coming down from the northwest that had nothing to do with ordinary Dakota winter weather. He also understood with a clarity that arrived like cold water what his father had just committed the town's families to instead. He did not say anything. He put on his hat and followed his father out into the night, and the decision he made in that short walk to say nothing, to keep what he knew inside the closed architecture of his own skull, was the decision he would spend the better part of the next year trying to understand how he had made. Silas Holt walked ahead of him without speaking, and in the set of his father's shoulders, Gerard could read the specific tension of a man who has heard something he cannot unhear and has decided not to let it change anything. November 1st was a Wednesday, which mattered only because Marin had decided that beginning on the first of the month gave the work a cleaner internal logic. She was in this way her father's daughter. He had been a man of ledgers and schedules of things begun and ended on round numbers, even as she was in almost every other way that mattered her mother's. She spent the morning not with the spade, but with her feet walking the slope the way her mother had walked it when she was choosing where to build in 1839. You could not look at a slope from the outside and know it. You had to walk it at different times of day. Watch where the morning sun struck, first watch, where the water ran after rain, feel with your feet where the ground was solid and where it gave slightly indicating water table below. She had been walking this particular slope for 11 years and knew most of what it had to say, but she walked it again now with the specific attention of someone making a final decision, and the slope confirmed what she had already suspected. 2/3 of the way up on the section that faced most directly south, the morning sun hit the frosted grass at 8:15 and didn't leave until after 3 in the afternoon, the longest solar exposure on the entire property. The drainage from the slope ran west of this spot, not through it. The soil at this elevation was dense clay, not the sandy loam of the lower section, which meant it would pack hard once disturbed, and would hold the shape of whatever you asked it to hold. The northern ridge above this point blocked the prevailing north and northwest winds from hitting the slope, directly creating a natural wind shadow that would reduce the exterior thermal load on the structure by a significant margin. She drove her stakes and ran her twine, 24 feet east to west, 14 feet north to south, the same proportions her mother had used, refined across generations of Mandan construction through the kind of empirical iteration that academics called data collection and practical people called learning from what worked. She measured the diagonals to confirm the rectangle was true, adjusted one corner stake by 3 inches, and measured again. Then she picked up the spade. The first stroke into the October-hardened ground sent a shock up through the handle and into both wrists that she felt in her elbows and her shoulders simultaneously. The topsoil was locked roots interwoven with clay into a mat that was closer to concrete than earth in its resistance. She switched to the pickaxe after the first 20 minutes, breaking the surface open with overhead strikes that required her entire body weight coming forward and down, and then shoveling the loosened fragments into the wheelbarrow, and then walking the wheelbarrow to the downhill dump site she had staked 50 feet from the pit perimeter. Break, shovel, haul, dump. She did this for 4 hours. At the end of 4 hours, she sat down on the hard ground at the edge of what she had excavated and looked at it, 8 inches deep across perhaps a third of the rectangle. The kind of progress that, if you were trying to feel good about it, required a certain deliberate generosity of interpretation. Her right shoulder had a pain in it that she recognized as the specific pain of overused rotator cuff. She had had it once before, the year after Thomas died, when she had tried to keep up the woodshed in the barn and the house simultaneously on her own, and had pushed past the point where her body was capable of keeping pace with what she was asking of it. The pain was not debilitating. It was informational, the way all pain is informational if you are willing to receive the information without catastrophizing it. She looked at the town of Harrow's Crossing, below her a half-mile down the road, the straight lines of wooden houses, the white peak of Reverend Crane's church, the thick columns of smoke from the chimneys of families already burning through their winter wood at a rate that made a kind of cold mathematical sense when you understood how much heat a frame house lost through its walls per degree of exterior temperature differential. She watched the smoke for a moment. She watched the pale sky above the smoke, the low flat clouds that had the particular color she associated with a cold that intended to stay. The moment came then, and she let it come, rather than suppressing it, because she had found that suppressed moments accumulated interest and presented themselves later with less warning. It was simple and specific. She was 62 years old, and her shoulder was telling her something about the relationship between what she intended to do and what her body was currently capable of doing. And the gap between those two things was significant and real, and not going to be resolved by determination alone. She was one person. The pit needed to be 8 feet deep across 336 square feet. She had moved, by rough calculation, perhaps 40 cubic feet of earth in 4 hours. She needed to move approximately 2,700 cubic feet more. She sat with that arithmetic for a while. What came back to her was not a plan and not a motivation in any narrative sense of the word. What came back to her was a specific image, her mother's hands in the firelight of the Eartha Lodge, in the third night of the 1839 storm, stirring something in a clay pot with the complete and utter absence of drama, the way you do a thing when you have decided the thing will be done. Her mother had not been heroic in that moment. She had been present, and she had been practical, and she had kept moving in the specific way that keeping moving required, not because she wasn't afraid or exhausted or uncertain about how many more days the storm would last, but because the crock needed stirring, and tomorrow needed whatever today could do for it. Marin picked up the pickaxe. She worked until the light failed, which in late October meant 4:30 in the afternoon, and when she stopped, she had moved the excavation to 14 inches across the full rectangle. Her hands had 2 blisters that had opened and reformed as harder tissue already. Her lower back had opinions that she acknowledged and set aside. She had moved, by her estimate, just over 100 cubic feet of earth in a single day. It was not enough, and it was also something. The following morning, she was back at 7 before the frost had broken on the grass, and the rhythm of the work that would define the next 6 weeks began in earnest. The pickaxe loosening what the night's freeze had locked harder, the spade collecting what the pickaxe had broken, the wheelbarrow carrying it away, the body adapting in the incremental and unglamorous way that bodies adapt to repeated stress, building callus and muscle, and the particular economy of motion that comes from doing the same physical task until the waste is burned out of it. She was aware of being watched. Not constantly, not obtrusively, but she was aware a rider who paused on the road below for a minute before moving on a pair of women who stood at the fence line of the lower field and looked up at the strange figure on the hill before returning to whatever had brought them out. She did not look back at them. She had learned a long time ago that returning the gaze of people watching you with skepticism was an invitation to engage with the skepticism and engagement. With skepticism was a use of energy that the hill required for other purposes. On the fourth morning, she came out of her house to find a wooden bucket sitting by the gate. It was new. She could see the unweathered wood, the clean iron hoops, the sound construction of something made by someone who knew what they were doing. There was no note. There was no one in the road or on the slope below. She looked at the bucket for a long moment, picked it up, and put it to use. She had seen the young man Daniel Webb standing in the field below her property on several of the previous evenings, after what she assumed was the end of his working day from the way his clothes and posture suggested recent labor. He was 22 or 23, she estimated, with the particular quality of stillness that belonged either to people who thought a great deal or to people who had learned that stillness was less costly than action. He never approached. He never called out. He simply stood and watched, and then he was gone. And the next evening, he was back. She had not determined what to do with his presence, so she had done nothing with it, which was frequently the correct response to uncertain data. The bucket was a different kind of data. It was a choice someone had made before dawn, leaving something of value and choosing not to be there when she found it. She understood this kind of gesture, the generosity that does not want to impose itself, that gives what it can and then removes itself from the equation so the receiver cannot feel obligated. She had made this kind of gesture herself at various points in her life. She understood that it was not weakness. She also understood that it was not yet courage. She thought about the bucket again that night, sitting by the small stove in her house for what she suspected would be one of the last nights she spent there before the move into the shelter. She thought about what kind of person left a useful thing without explanation and what that person might or might not be capable of if circumstances changed. She had no answer yet. She filed the question away in the place she kept things she was not done thinking about. On the 12th day of excavation, she was below the root layer and into pure clay, which was harder but in some ways more satisfying. It came up in clean chunks rather than the tangled, resistant mass of the topsoil, and it packed into the wheelbarrow with a dense efficiency that made the hauling feel more productive. The pit was 4 feet deep across the full rectangle, which meant she had moved approximately 1,300 cubic feet of earth and was roughly halfway to the depth she needed. Her body had stopped complaining in the urgent way of the first week and had settled into the steady background ache of sustained work, which she found preferable, the body communicating maintenance rather than emergency. It was on this day that she became aware of a new presence at the edge of her property line. Gerard Holt was not trying to conceal himself. He stood at the fence line with the posture of someone who had a right to be where he was, which technically he did. He was on the road, not on her land. He was dressed for the cold in a coat she recognized as expensive, the kind with a wool exterior and a lining that cost more than the coat. And he had the educated hands of someone who worked with paper and measurement instruments more than tools. He was watching her work with the specific attention of someone who was not watching the person, but the object the person was working on. She watched him watching her structure. She saw his eyes track the line of the pit walls, the slope of the planned roof line she had indicated with stakes, the position of the pipe holes she had already roughed in at the north end of the ceiling frame. She saw the moment when he recognized what he was looking at. It was subtle, a small shift in the angle of his head, a brief stillness that preceded the resumption of his scanning, and she understood that he was not there out of idle curiosity. She drove her pickaxe into the clay and let him look. He was there for 2 hours. When he left, he walked down the road toward town without looking back. That evening in the house that Silas Holt had built at the east end of Harrow's Crossing, a conversation took place that no one was meant to know about. Silas Holt was a man who understood the economy of information the way he understood the economy of lumber, as a resource to be managed, allocated strategically, and kept from flowing toward people who might use it against you. He had sent Gerard to the slope with specific instructions, Find something structurally unsound, a code violation, a safety hazard, something that would give the town council grounds to order the construction stopped. He had reasons for wanting it stopped that he had not articulated fully even to himself, though they were not difficult to locate if you were willing to look at the account books and the loan documents from the Hartford Bank and the commitment he had made to double cordwood production for a town that was now implicitly being told by a 62-year-old woman in a dirt pit that cordwood was the wrong answer. Gerard stood in front of his father and said, "There is nothing unsound about it. The structure is correctly engineered. The thermal design is sound. The ventilation system is passive and self-regulating. A pause, the kind of pause that is a decision being made in real time. She knows what she's doing." Silas Holt was quiet for a period that extended past the comfortable range of silence between a father and a son. "You will not say that to anyone." His voice was flat in the way that things are flat when the emotion has been pressed out of them by long practice. "You will not repeat what you've just said to me to anyone in this town for any reason." Gerard looked at his father for a moment, and in that moment he was looking at something more specific than the man. He was looking at the mechanism beneath the man, the thing that had been driving decisions for longer than he had been alive, the thing that called itself pragmatism and business sense and providing for the family and was at its simplest fear wearing a coat that fit well. "Yes, sir," Gerard said. He went upstairs to the room he had occupied since returning from Boston, and he sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and he thought about the woman on the hill with her pickaxe and her mathematical precision and her knowledge that she had carried for 35 years without using it because the world had not given her a reason to believe it would be received. He thought about what he had seen in that pit, not just the design, but the quality of the decision-making, the way every element addressed a specific failure mode that conventional construction did not address. He thought about the winter that he had also been watching gather itself on the northern horizon in the data of temperatures and pressure systems and the early hardening of the ground. He sat in the dark, and he did not do anything with what he knew. That silence made in the dark in November would cost him something later that no accounting system he had learned in Boston could adequately measure. But he did not know that yet. He only knew that his father was afraid and that he had been trained since childhood to understand his father's fear as a fact of the natural world, like gravity, like cold, like the way debt accumulated interest while you slept. Something you worked within rather than against. Below his window, the town of Harrow's Crossing went about its evening's business, stacking wood-shuttering windows burning through the early hours of a winter that had not yet shown what it intended. The chimneys sent their columns of smoke straight up into the windless night, and from above, if you had been watching, they might have looked like a signal of some kind. They were not a signal, they were just smoke, and the wind was coming that would scatter it, and the woman in the pit on the hill had already done the calculation. The north wall came first, because the north wall was where the winter would press hardest, and Marin had learned from her mother that you built your strongest defense at the point of greatest threat, rather than distributing effort evenly across all fronts. The fieldstones came from the dry creek bed at the bottom of her property, where decades of water movement had sorted and smoothed them into the dense, heavy oblongs that held heat the way nothing else she had access to could hold it. She moved them in the wheelbarrow, 6 or 7 at a time, depending on size, making the trip from creek to pit a dozen times each day until her forearms had developed a new rope of muscle along the outside edge that she noticed when she washed her hands at night. The mortar was clay and water mixed in a wooden trough she had constructed from salvaged lumber, and she applied it with her hands rather than a trowel because her hands gave her more information about consistency and coverage than any tool she had tried. Her mother had done the same, and when Marin pressed the clay into the joints between stones, smoothing it flat with her thumb, she was performing a gesture that was older than any building technique the men in town would have recognized as legitimate, older than the territory itself, older than the word territory applied to this particular piece of ground. The gesture did not feel ancient when she made it. It felt correct. She built the interior retaining wall against the north face 2 feet thick, which meant the combined mass of packed earth behind it and stone in front of it presented approximately 4 feet of thermal resistance to whatever the air on the other side decided to do. Every stone she set was heavier than it looked, and by the 3rd day of wall building, her back had moved past the stage of protest into something more fundamental, a deep structural fatigue that lived in the muscles flanking her spine and announced itself most clearly when she first stood after kneeling. She stood anyway every time, and the standing got marginally easier across the week, in the way that things get easier when your body finally accepts that the demand is not going away and decides to adapt rather than continue arguing. The east and west walls she packed and smoothed to a hardness that surprised her. The clay at this depth was dense enough that, once tamped and dried for a few days, it held the impression of her palm without crumbling. She tested sections of it by pushing with her full weight through both hands, and the wall gave nothing. It had become, in the language her mother had used, part of the hill rather than a structure placed inside it. And that was the distinction that mattered. A structure placed inside the earth fought the earth. A structure that became the earth was held by it. The roof was the problem she had been saving, not because she was avoiding it, but because she had been gathering the resources and the calculations, simultaneously running the numbers in her head during the long physical hours of excavation and wall work, refining the angles, checking the load math against what the timber she had available could actually support. The main ridgepole needed to span the full 14-foot width and carry the weight of whatever accumulated on the roof earth and snow, both in quantities she had to estimate conservatively, which meant assuming the worst winter she could construct in her imagination and then adding a safety margin on top of that. She had been watching the Aldersham property for 2 weeks, timing her visit for a day when the road was clear and the weather was holding and she had enough daylight left after the walk to do what she needed to do. The farm had burned 3 years prior in a fire that had started in the kitchen and consumed the house before the bucket brigade from town could do anything useful. The family was gone, moved back east to relatives, and the site had acquired the reputation of a haunted place, which Marin found useful in the specific way that other people's superstition was always useful to someone willing to be practical about it. It kept the salvage untouched. She left before dawn on a Wednesday in late November, pulling the two-wheeled cart she had modified with a rope harness that distributed the pulling weight across her shoulders and hips rather than concentrating it in her hands. The road was frozen solid, which made the cart easier to pull than soft ground would have allowed, and the 5 miles passed in a cold that was severe enough to keep her moving at a pace that generated sufficient warmth to make it manageable. The Aldersham site was exactly as she had expected, the house foundation still visible, the chimney standing like a monument to everything that hadn't burned, the charred timbers lying in the patterns they had fallen when the structure collapsed. She moved through the debris with the methodical attention her mother had taught her to apply to any landscape that contained things of value, reading the ground rather than reacting to it, building a map of what was present before beginning to take anything. The south-facing parlor windows had blown out early, as she had hoped. Glass in a fire frame either melts or exits the frame intact depending on timing, and the parlor windows had apparently exited. She found them under a layer of dead grass and early snow, 3 feet from the foundation line, 7 sashes in total, each measuring approximately 3 feet by 5 feet, with the glass still seated in the wood frame. She loaded them onto the cart with care that went beyond what the physical fragility of the glass required. She was loading time as well as material, weeks of labor represented in each intact pane, and she handled them with the hands of someone who understood that there was no replacement available if she damaged what she had found. She packed them with the strips of burlap she had brought for exactly this purpose, stacking them on edge in the cart bed with padding between each sash. The walk back took longer than the walk out because the cart was loaded, and the loaded cart required attention on any section of road where the ice had roughened overnight, which on a 5-mile road in late November was most of it. She developed a rhythm of checking the surface 3 steps ahead while pulling with a consistent pressure, not jerking the cart over rough patches but flowing it through them, the way water finds a path rather than forcing one. 200 yards from her gate, the front wheel hit a section of road where the ice had formed over a rut she hadn't registered on the outbound journey. The cart lurched left, the harness pulled her sideways, and she had perhaps a third of a second to decide between going down with the cart and letting the harness go. She let it go. The cart went over. She stood in the frozen road and listened to the specific sound of glass meeting ice-covered ground, not the single clean break of a dropped drinking glass, but a sequence of sounds overlapping, some sharp and some dull, that told her before she looked that the news was going to be bad. She walked to the cart. 5 of the 7 sashes had broken, some cleanly across the middle, some in the corner-to-corner diagonal that meant the frame had flexed before the glass gave. 2 sashes were intact. She could see this clearly in the gray afternoon light, and she stood with it for a long moment without moving. The arithmetic was immediate and merciless. 2 sashes gave her 30 square feet of glazing surface. She needed a minimum of 90 square feet for the roof panel to function as designed, enough area to capture meaningful solar gain on the short December days when the sun crossed the sky at its lowest angle. 30 square feet would give her something, but something was not the same as sufficient, and she had not spent 6 weeks in the ground to build something that would merely reduce the cold rather than defeat it. She righted the cart. She loaded the 2 intact sashes with the same care she had used loading all 7. She pulled the cart home. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with the lamp turned low to conserve oil, and she held the problem in her mind the way she had learned to hold hard things, not gripping them, because gripping produced heat and heat produced distortion, but holding them loosely enough that they could be examined from all sides. She could not go back to Aldersham. The road was closing and the remaining sashes had broken in ways that made them unusable, even if she could have retrieved them. She had $12 left from her original 47, and the general store carried single panes at a price that put even 4 additional sashes beyond what $12 could reach. There was no glass supplier within practical distance at this point in the season. She thought about her mother in 1839 with the particular quality of thought she reserved for problems that required a different kind of intelligence than she had been applying. Her mother had been a woman of considerable practical ingenuity, but the specific ingenuity she kept returning to was not the engineering or the construction, it was the resource identification. Her mother had always known where things were, not because she had supernatural access to information, but because she paid attention to what was around her in the sustained, patient way that most people paid attention only to what was directly in front of them. Marin went to bed without a solution. Solutions that weren't ready to arrive yet were not helped by being forced. The knock came at 7 in the morning. She heard it from the bedroom, 2 beats deliberate and quiet, the kind of knock that is not trying to startle you. She dressed and went to the door. Daniel Webb stood in the road outside, her gate hat in his hands despite the cold, which told her the conversation he had prepared for was formal in his own mind, even if it wouldn't be formal in practice. He was 22 years old. She was now certain with the build of someone who had grown up doing physical work but had not yet fully settled into it. Still some angularity to his frame, still the lean quality of a young man's strength, rather than the consolidated density of a man past 30 who has been working consistently. Beside him on the road, resting against the gatepost, was a single large pane of glass in a wooden frame, 3 feet by 5 feet, intact. The wood of the frame was the same pine she recognized from the storage side of Holt's lumberyard. She looked at the glass. She looked at him. His eyes moved to her left shoulder and stayed there, which was either shyness or the particular discomfort of someone who has done something they're not entirely certain they had the right to do. My father doesn't use that window. His voice was quiet and slightly rough from the cold. It's been in the storage building for 2 years. He bought it for the east wall of the yard office and then decided against the office. She considered this for a moment. Does your father know you're here? No. She looked at the pane again, 3 feet by 5. Added to her 2 remaining Aldersham sashes, this gave her 45 square feet, still not 90, but more than halfway, and there was a design modification forming in her mind that involved steepening the angle of the remaining glazing to compensate for reduced area squeezing, more efficiency from fewer square feet, by optimizing the capture angle more precisely. It would require adjusting 2 of the roof beams, which she had not yet set. It was solvable. "Come in," she said. "There's coffee." He came in and accepted the coffee with both hands in the way of someone who has been cold for longer than this particular morning. She waited because she had learned that Daniel Webb was a person who would arrive at his own words if given sufficient space, and that rushing him would produce less information rather than more. "Why do you help me?" Not hostile, genuinely asking. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then, when I was 8 years old, my grandfather died in the 3rd week of February. The family said it was God's plan. The minister gave a sermon about accepting the designs of providence." He turned the coffee cup in his hand, studying the motion. "I didn't believe it then. I still don't. I think the house was cold. I think he died because the house was cold and there was nothing in it that could hold heat against the Dakota February. That's all I think it was." A pause. "I watched what you're building up there. I've been watching it for a month. I think you're right about all of it. She nodded. And you brought a window. I brought a window. It isn't enough, but it's enough to change the design from impossible to difficult. She set her coffee down. That's the only kind of problem worth having. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. She asked him because she needed to understand the risk he was taking. What happens when your father notices the pain is gone? Daniel met her eyes for the first time in the conversation. I'll tell him I broke it. He left 20 minutes later, and she stood at the window watching him walk back on toward town with his hands in his pockets. And she filed what she had learned about him in the category of useful certainties, a small category, but one she valued precisely because of its size. 2 nights later, the sound woke her at 2 in the morning. It was not a loud sound, and she might have slept through it if she had not been sleeping lightly in the way she had been sleeping since the construction entered its final phases, close to the surface alert to anything anomalous. What she heard was the brief, sharp report of breaking glass, different in quality from the kitchen window, rattle that cold-induced expansion, sometimes produced different enough that she was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she had consciously identified what the sound was. She went to the shelter rather than away from it. The damage was in the upper left corner of the center Aldersham sash, a triangular break 2 sides roughly 8 inches, where something had struck the glass from the outside. The object itself was still there, a creek stone rounded approximately the size of a fist. It had not come from the creek bed on her property, which produced smoother, flatter stones. It had come from somewhere else. She looked at the stone for a long time in the lantern light. She looked at the angle of impact relative to the road below and the ridge above, and arrived at the most likely point of origin, which was the middle section of the road approximately 60 yards to the northeast. She looked at the light still visible in the Holt lumberyard at an hour when no legitimate business required illumination. She did not have proof. She had geometry and probability and the knowledge that men who feel threatened by something they cannot control sometimes do small, violent things to it rather than reconsidering their position. This was not a revelation. It was a confirmation of something she had already understood about the specific combination of fear and pride that she was working against. She made pine pitcher the next morning, a process her mother had taught her that required collecting the crystallized resin from the pine trees on the north edge of her property, heating it carefully in a small pot until it liquefied, and mixing it with rendered fat and a small amount of powdered charcoal to improve its adhesive properties and reduce its brittleness in cold. She applied it to the broken corner in layers, pressing strips of heavy cloth into the hot pitch, letting each layer cure before adding the next. When she finished, the repair was not invisible, but it was sound. The corner would hold. It would not hold the same way glass held, but it would hold against wind and snow, and the ordinary pressure of weather was what she needed it to hold against. The other kind of pressure, the kind delivered by a thrown stone in the dark, she addressed differently. She made a point of working visible hours near the glass sections of the roof for the next several days, not ostentatiously, but consistently, in the way that a lighthouse does not shine in any particular direction, but is simply present and illuminated. The lamp in the Holt yard was not lit past midnight again. The roof framing went up in the first week of December, and it was the most physically dangerous work she had done, which was a category with considerable competition by that point in the project. She was working alone with timber that required 2 people to position safely, which meant she was working with ropes and levers and the calculated application of momentum rather than with assistance using physics to substitute for the second person she did not have. The ridgepole went up in a process that took 4 hours and left her with a deep bruise across her left shoulder where a rope had slipped and the timber had swung into her before she got the load back under control. She stood under the recovered pole and breathed through the pain and did not allow herself to consider what would have happened if the slip had been half a second later or the timber had been moving with slightly more velocity. The front post stood 10 feet high, the rear posts 2 feet, creating the steep pitch she needed 45 degrees on the glazed face catching the winter sun at an angle that would maximize thermal transfer during the short days when the sun cleared the ridge for perhaps 6 hours. She had calculated this on paper first and then recalculated it with stakes and shadows on the slope itself, and the 2 calculations agreed to within a degree which satisfied her. The rafters went across the width of the structure at 24-inch intervals, And onto the rafters went the planking for the earthen north section of the roof, and onto the planking went the oilcloth she had purchased at the general store. With the last of her construction budget, and onto the oilcloth went 3 feet of the excavated earth she had been piling downhill for 6 weeks, hauled back up now in the wheelbarrow and tamped into place with the flat of the spade. The structure from the north and from above disappeared into the hillside. This was not incidental. This was the design. The glazed section she installed on a Thursday, working from below, with the ropes she had rigged through blocks she had anchored to the ridgepole, raising each sash into the tilted frame she had built at the 45-degree angle, and securing it with the wooden battens she had prepared. She caulked every joint with the pine pitch mixture, working in the cold with chilled hands that she warmed periodically against her coat, pressing the pitch into the gaps until each seam was sealed, and she could hold her palm flat against the glass and feel no movement of air against her skin. The modified design, 3 sashes instead of 6, the angle adjusted to 48 degrees to compensate for the reduced area, gave her a glazing panel that was smaller than originally planned and engineered more precisely than the original would have needed to be. She had spent 3 evenings calculating the solar gain numbers by hand, working in the margins of one of Thomas's old account books, because she had no blank paper. And the numbers told her that the steeper angle, in combination with the highly reflective snow cover she was expecting, would actually deliver comparable daily heat gain to the larger, shallower panel she had planned. The limitation had required a solution that was in the end superior to the original. She thought about this for a moment when she finished the last caulked seam. The way problems sometimes contained improvements, if you were willing to look at them long enough rather than just resenting them, and then she stopped thinking about it because the light was failing and she had the ventilation pipes to run. The intake pipe was the more complex of the two. She buried it in a trench she had dug along the south face of the slope, running it 30 feet from the exterior air intake to the point where it entered the shelter at the base of the glazed wall. The purpose was thermal exchange. Air entering at the exterior end would travel 30 feet through earth that held a constant temperature significantly above the exterior, air temperature arriving inside the shelter, measurably warmer than when it entered. Not warm by indoor standards, but warmer than outside, and every degree of pre-warming was a degree of work the interior heating system did not have to do. The exhaust pipe ran from the highest point of the ceiling at the rear of the shelter through the earthen roof and emerged on the uphill side of the structure, which meant it exited into the wind shadow rather than the wind face, reducing the risk of the pressure differential, forcing cold air backward through the system. The physics of the circulation were simple. Warm air rose, accumulated at the ceiling, found the path of least resistance upward and out, and its departure created a partial void that drew the pre-warmed intake air in at the floor level. No moving parts, no maintenance requirements, no failure mode that a storm could trigger. The hollow stone bench along the north wall was the last piece, and it was the piece she felt most satisfied by in the engineering sense because it was the element that would multiply the efficiency of the entire heating system by the largest factor. She had constructed it from fieldstones set in clay mortar in the same technique as the wall building, a long rectangular chamber approximately 8 inches high in the interior, with the cast iron stove sitting at the western end and the stovepipe running horizontally through the bench cavity, the full 14-foot length before turning and exiting vertically through the roof. Every cubic foot of combustion gas had to travel 14 feet of enclosed stone channeling before leaving the structure, surrendering heat to the stone mass with every foot of travel. The bench would take 2 days to fully heat after the first fire, but once it reached thermal equilibrium, it would maintain a radiant output through the night on an amount of wood that a conventional cast iron stove would consume in 2 hours without producing a fraction of the same effect. She had traded for the stove in October before the meeting, anticipating that she would need it, and that the terms of trade would be easier before she became publicly controversial. Martha Finney, the blacksmith's wife, had a talent for practical transaction, divorced from social judgment. She needed winter mending done. Marin needed a stove, and the exchange was conducted over coffee one afternoon without any discussion of town politics or earth shelters or what the neighbors would think. Martha Finney's opinion of Marin Calloway was not recorded anywhere because Martha Finney kept her opinions in a place they were not available to the public, which was an organizational system Marin had considerable respect for. The final inspection took place on December 10th, 2 days before she had planned, and one day after the second significant snowfall of the season had deposited 8 inches on the ground and made the exterior temperature a sustained 12 degrees Fahrenheit. She went through the structure systematically, the way her mother had gone through it in 1839, testing seams with a dampened finger to feel for air movement, checking the mortar joints for any separation that the freeze-thaw cycling had opened, confirming the operation of both ventilation pipes by holding a strip of cloth near each opening, and watching for the movement that indicated airflow. Everything held, everything worked. She stood in the completed shelter in the middle of the day, with no fire burning and no lantern lit, and looked at what the winter sun was doing through the angled glass above her. It came in at the shallow angle of December light, hitting the north stone wall directly, and spreading across the floor in a band of pale warmth that was genuinely warm against her palm when she held it flat to receive the light. The interior temperature without any supplemental heat was 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside it was 12. The difference was 41 degrees maintained by physics rather than fuel. She did not allow herself to feel triumphant about this because triumph was an emotion that belonged to finished things and the work was not finished. And also because triumph at the completion of preparation was a way of borrowing emotional satisfaction from a future that had not yet been paid for. What she allowed herself to feel was something smaller and more precise, the particular satisfaction of a calculation that had checked out when tested against reality, which was the only place calculations ultimately mattered. Alderman Prescott made his official visit on December 12th, arriving at the edge of her property in the late afternoon, with the careful posture of a man who has prepared his expression in advance. He stood at the boundary of her land and delivered his assessment in the official register he used for civic communications. The structure was an eyesore. The council accepted no liability for any harm it might cause her. He was noting his objection for the record. He was thorough and complete, and utterly disconnected from the object he was objecting to, in the way that people are disconnected from the things they have already decided about. Marin looked up at him from the bench where she was checking the stovepipe connections. Her face was dirty from the clay work, and her coat was the old one she used for the heaviest labor, worn through at one elbow and repaired with a leather patch. She said without hostility and without apology, "I am not asking for your approval, Alderman Prescott. I never was." He left. She watched his back as he walked down to the road, the set of his shoulders carrying something she recognized as the specific discomfort of a man who has issued a pronouncement and received in return not argument, not deference, but simply the information that the pronouncement was irrelevant. It was the most efficient kind of disagreement because it required no maintenance. On December 15th, with the exterior temperature at 8 degrees and falling, she moved her possessions into the earth lodge. Her mother's trunk, which contained the things she could not replace, a bundle of correspondence in her mother's handwriting in Mandan, a small piece of worked quill work that had belonged to her maternal grandmother, Thomas's pocket watch, that she never carried but could not part with a daguerreotype of her 2 children, taken in 1868, that she looked at less often than she wanted to. Her books, 7 of them, which represented both her library and her philosophy about the sustainable weight of possessions. Her food stores packed in the clay pots she had been filling since August with the dried and preserved products of the summer garden. Her firewood stacked in the alcove she had built into the east wall specifically to bring it inside and keep it dry. She closed the door at dusk, sitting on the stone bench with her lantern and a book she was too present to read. The wind was beginning to pick up outside. She could hear it at the ridge above, moving with a new quality of seriousness, a pitch change from the autumn wind that everyone in this territory learned to recognize as the prelude to something purposeful. Inside the shelter, the air was cool but not cold, sitting at 51 degrees in the fading warmth of the day's solar gain. She did not light the stove. She sat in her coat and read 3 pages of her book and listened to the wind increasing and thought about the people in the wooden houses below her burning through their cordwood at a rate they had not planned for in structures that were losing heat faster than the fires inside them could replace it with a confidence that had been manufactured in a meeting room and would be tested by something considerably less forgiving than a meeting room. She thought about Emmett Shaw, who had nodded and been silent. She thought about what he knew and what had kept him from saying it. She put the book down and sat with the lantern and the stone and the quad, and she was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was holding the weight of being right in a situation where being right conferred no protection on anyone who had not listened to her, and that weight was not triumphant and not comfortable, and not something she had language for exactly. She was also warm. On December 18th, 3 days after she had moved in, she woke at 5 in the morning to a silence so complete it had a physical quality like pressure against the eardrums. The wind had stopped. Not diminished, stopped with the totality of something that has gathered itself before a final effort. She looked through the glazed roof at the sky. Even in the pre-dawn darkness, she could see it. The sky to the north had a different character than night sky, a low, massive darkness that absorbed light rather than containing it, moving with the deliberate totality of a geographic feature rather than a weather event. She got up and put 3 logs in the stove and closed the damper to its most efficient setting and checked every seal in the structure with her hands in the cold air. She filled her water containers from the barrel she kept inside. She laid out her food stores in the order she would access them. She sat down on the warm stone bench and opened her hands in her lap and breathed. The storm arrived not as snow, but as a change in the fundamental nature of the air outside a transformation so rapid and complete that within minutes of the first gust, the exterior conditions were no longer a version of cold she had any prior experience of. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in the first 10 minutes by the outdoor thermometer she could read through the glass. The wind loaded from the northwest at a sustained force that she felt through the earthen walls, not as sound exactly, but as vibration, low-frequency pressure that the mass of the structure absorbed and distributed and ultimately held against without yielding. The glass above her sank briefly in its frame as the first real gust hit it, then settled. The angle deflected the wind rather than resisting it, another of her mother's principles, the one about not meeting force directly when redirection was available. The snow, when it came, was not the soft falling kind. It was horizontal and fine, and it hit the glass like thrown sand, and then slid down and off the steep angle and began to build a drift against the front of the structure that Marin watched accumulate with something approaching gratitude. The drift would add insulation. The insulation would hold the interior temperature higher. The storm was working for her even as it worked against everything below. She put water on the stove. She waited. In town, the storm arrived in the houses of Harrow's Crossing as an invader finds a house with unlocked doors, not by forcing entry, but by entering through every gap simultaneously, patient and distributed, working along the path of least resistance through every section of clapboard siding, where the chinking had dried and cracked every window frame, where the glazing compound had shrunk with the autumn cold, every place where 2 boards met imperfectly, because boards always met imperfectly, and in ordinary winters, the imperfection was tolerable. Silas Holt's house was 2 stories of Dakota fir construction, built 9 years ago with the best materials his operation had produced at the time, which meant it was better than most houses in Harrow's Crossing, and worse than it needed to be for what was happening now. The walls were 2 inches of exterior board, plus an air gap, plus 2 inches of interior board, and the air gap, which builders sometimes filled with sawdust or newspaper for additional insulation, had been left empty because Holt had decided the cost of filling it was not justified for a house at this latitude. The empty air gap transferred cold with an efficiency that a material with actual insulating properties would have moderated significantly. He sat in his parlor on the first night of the storm and watched his cast-iron stove consume wood at a rate he had not planned for. The house was cold despite the fire in a way he did not initially understand, and then understood too well. The fire was generating heat, substantial heat, but the walls were radiating it outward faster than the fire could replace it. The physics were straightforward and did not care about his plans. His cordwood, stacked high and confident against the south wall of the barn, was burning at 3 times the rate he had budgeted for. Gerard sat across from him and said nothing. He had been saying nothing for 6 weeks in the specific way that men say nothing when what they know is too expensive to speak. He watched his father's face in the firelight and saw the moment when the arithmetic arrived, when Holt calculated the rate of consumption against the supply on hand, against the duration of the storm, and arrived at a number that changed the quality of his expression from inconvenienced to alarmed. In the church, Reverend Crane knelt on frozen floorboards and prayed with the specific intensity of a man who has exhausted his other options. The church had no residential heat source. It had the large central fireplace and the bodies of congregants, and with the storm keeping everyone inside their own homes, the fireplace was the only warmth available, and it was losing. He prayed not because he believed prayer would alter the thermodynamics of the situation, but because prayer was the action available to him, and he had nothing else to offer the night except his presence in it. He thought kneeling there about the woman on the hill with her mother's knowledge and her mother's hands and the 41-degree differential she had produced from physics and stone. He thought about the word pagan, which he had used in a public meeting to dismiss an engineering principle, and the thought was not comfortable. In the house at the east edge of town, the O'Connell family had burned their last cord of wood before midnight of the second day. They had burned faster because the house sat exposed on the eastern edge with no windbreak, and because the construction was lighter than average, and because Daniel O'Connell had bought his wood from Holt's latest stock, which burned with the beautiful enthusiasm of green timber and left behind a fraction of the heat that the burning suggested. After the wood was gone, they burned the kitchen chairs and then the kitchen table. The cold did not wait for them to run out of things to burn. It came in while they still had furniture left, settling into the corners, and the spaces between people who were trying very hard to share what warmth their bodies produced. On the morning of the fourth day, Emmett Shaw was found in his chair. Daniel Webb found him making his way through the chest-deep snow between buildings with a length of rope tied to the door handle of the house he had been sheltering in and to his own wrist so that he could not lose direction in the whiteout conditions. He found Shaw because he had been checking on the older residents who lived alone, moving from house to house in the punishing cold, with the systematic care of someone who understood that systematic care was the only thing standing between intention and chaos in conditions like these. Shaw was seated in his armchair by the fireplace, which had gone cold sometime in the night. His hands were in his lap, and in his right hand, closed loosely, in the particular relaxed grip of a person who has died quietly rather than struggling, was a folded piece of paper. Daniel, his own hands almost too cold to function, unfolded it. The handwriting was shaky in the way of an old man writing in a cold room with fingers that had lost most of their fine motor cooperation, but it was legible. A name and a direction: Marin Calloway, South Slope, 1/2 mile North Road, look for the pipe at the ridge. He had known. He had known in October when he nodded and stayed seated, and he had known through all the weeks since, and when the moment arrived where knowing could no longer be separated from action. He had written the address down and prepared to go, and he had not made it out of his chair. Daniel stood in the cold room with the piece of paper and the old man and the silence, and something reorganized itself inside him, in the way that things reorganize when the cost of inaction becomes visible and specific and sits in an armchair in front of you with its hands in its lap. He put the paper in his pocket. He found Prescott in the town hall, which was functioning as a gathering point for the families whose houses had become untenable. 8 people in the building as of that morning, burning the last of the hall's cordwood in the main fireplace, the interior temperature hovering at 22 degrees despite the fire. Prescott was standing near the window with the posture of a man who has been standing near things rather than doing them, and when Daniel came through the door with ice on his coat and Emmett Shaw's piece of paper in his hand, and the expression of someone who has made a decision, Prescott straightened slightly in the way of a man recognizing that the moment has shifted. "The O'Connell family," Daniel said. "Where are they?" Prescott's face answered before he did. Daniel held up the paper. He said what it said. He said what it meant. He looked at the alderman and at Holt, who had arrived at the town hall that morning with his wife and the 2 youngest children, and at Gerard Holt standing to one side with his arms folded and his eyes on the floor, and at the other men in the room, and he said what Emmett Shaw had known and written down and not been able to deliver. "She's alive." His voice had no drama in it. "She was right about all of it, and she's alive, and the question in front of us right now is simple." Prescott looked at his granddaughter, who was sitting on a bench near the fire with her lips the color of bruised fruit and her eyes too still for a 7-year-old. He did not take long. 5 men went out into the White Death, and the White Death tried to keep them. Prescott was the first through the town hall door, and the wind took him immediately, not with the casual indifference of ordinary cold, but with the focused malice of something that had been waiting. It hit him across the face like a flat board swung hard, driving ice crystals into every exposed surface of skin and stealing the breath from his lungs before he had completed his first step. He had lived in Dakota Territory for 22 years and had considered himself a man who knew cold. He understood now in the first 10 seconds of being outside that he had known a polite version of it, cold, that announced itself and allowed you to negotiate. This was not that. This was the fundamental thing, the original condition, the temperature, the Earth defaulted to when the sun was not there to argue otherwise. Gerard Holt came out second, then Daniel Webb, then two men named Farrow and Guthrie, who had said little in the town hall, but had stood up when Daniel stood up, which was his own kind of statement. They tied the rope through belt loops and around wrists, linking themselves in a chain of 5, and the rope was both a practical tool and an admission, an acknowledgement that individual navigation was not possible in conditions where visibility dropped to the length of your own arm, and direction became a matter of faith rather than observation. The 600 yards to Marin's property took 1 hour and 50 minutes. Daniel led because he had been outside more than anyone else in the past 4 days, moving between buildings in the methodical way he had developed, and his body had built a partial accommodation to the conditions that the others lacked. He moved by feel as much as sight, reading the ground through his boots, keeping the wind at a consistent angle on his left side, because he had established on the first day that the ridge ran northeast to southwest, and the wind was from the northwest, which meant keeping it on the left cheek meant moving roughly south toward the slope. The logic held until it didn't, and when it didn't, he stopped and waited and rebuilt it from the pressure of the wind against his body and the slight upward grade he could feel beginning under his feet. Prescott fell twice. The first time Farrow and Gerard hauled him up without slowing. The second time he stayed down for a moment longer than the first, and Daniel turned back on the rope and crouched beside him in the scour of the wind, and Prescott looked up at him with the expression of a man discovering something about his own limits that he would have preferred not to know. He got up, he kept moving. Whatever he had been before the storm, whatever the title and the authority and the 15 years of civic management had made of him, he was something simpler. Out here, a body moving through cold toward warmth. That was all, and it was enough, and it was more honest than anything he had been in a long time. The slope materialized out of the white, rather than appearing first a slight change in the texture of the wind, the ridge above breaking the worst of the gusts into something slightly less organized, then the ground rising under their feet at the angle Marin had described as 2/3 of the way up a south-facing hill. They searched by feel, spreading the rope between them to cover more surface hands moving through snow that had packed to the density of packed sand. The surface gave nothing. The storm had smoothed everything into a single continuous white architecture, featureless and absolute. Gerard found the pipe. His left hand closed around the metal when he was chest deep in a drift, his arm thrust down through snow that had compressed against the front of the structure, and for a moment he did not understand what he was holding. Then he understood. He pulled upward until the pipe was clear of the drift and held it exposed in the screaming air, and from the opening at the top came something that was not visible exactly, but was present, a thermal signature, a subtle warping of the air above the opening, that his engineer's eye recognized as the distortion caused by temperature differential. Not smoke, not vapor. Simply the shape of warmth rising through a column of cold invisible, except to someone who knew what they were looking at and was looking for it. He called out and the others came to him through the rope, and they dug with their hands because they had no tools working in the frantic economy of people who understand that stopping is not an option and that their hands are the only option available. The snow packed again as fast as they moved it until they learned to throw it far enough to the sides that it couldn't immediately refill the excavation. They uncovered the top edge of the glass. First, the angled surface had shed most of the accumulation, leaving it relatively clear beneath the overburden of the drift. Then they dug down along the front face of the structure, following the angle of the glass, down to where the door frame should be, and the snow in this section was packed 10 feet deep from the drift that had built against the south face across 4 days of sustained 70-mile-per-hour wind. They dug a tunnel rather than an excavation, a narrow passage just wide enough for a man's shoulders descending steeply toward where the door had to be. It was the most primitive construction any of them had ever performed, pressing the tunnel walls smooth with their bodies as they went, the snow holding its shape under the pressure of their movement. Gerard went first because he had the engineer's instinct for what the structure beneath the snow would look like and where the door would be relative to the pipe he had found. His hands hit wood when he had gone perhaps 8 feet down from the surface drift, and he felt along the wood until he found the iron handle in the slight gap of the door frame. He knocked. The sound was a dull compression in the packed snow, more felt than heard, and he was not certain it had transmitted through the door at all. He knocked again harder using the heel of his fist. The wind above the tunnel entrance took whatever sound he made and scattered it. He pressed his face against the wood and said her name not loudly because loud required breath. And breath in this cold was a resource to be managed, but clearly directly into the grain of the door. The silence on the other side lasted long enough that he felt the specific cold of hope beginning to fail. Then a sound came through the wood, a scraping deliberate, the sound of a bolt being drawn back from the inside. The door opened inward, and the air that came through the opening was not the blast of a heated room, but something more patient. Warmth that had been sitting in stone and earth for weeks, slow accumulated and durable, the kind of temperature that did not spike and did not fade, but simply held like a kept promise. It smelled of pine smoke and clay, and dried herbs and something savory that required a moment to identify as food actually being prepared, which none of them had smelled since the storm began. Marin stood in the doorway with a lantern at her side, its light falling across her face and the space behind her. She was wearing her everyday wool dress and a shawl over her shoulders. No coat, no hat, nothing that suggested she was defending herself against anything. Her face had the composed quality that Gerard had observed on the slope in November, the quality of someone whose internal weather was not determined by external conditions, but there was something else in it now. Not surprised because she had told them she had been expecting them, but a careful attention, the kind you apply to something that is both anticipated and serious. Her eyes moved across each of them in the quick assessment of a person with medical knowledge evaluating damage. They stopped on Gerard for a fraction longer than on the others, and in that fraction, he understood that she knew who he was and what his father had sent him to do in November, and possibly what had been thrown through her glass in the night. The fraction passed, she opened the door the rest of the way. They came in one at a time, Prescott first at Daniel's gesture, then Guthrie, Farrow, Gerard, and finally Daniel himself, who pulled the insulated door shut behind him and threw the bolt and stood for a moment with his back against it, breathing. The shelter was 60 degrees. After the temperature outside 60 degrees was not a comfortable room temperature. It was a different category of experience. The body's interpretation of 60 degrees when it has been at -38 for 2 hours was not warmth exactly, but the cessation of dying which registered in the nervous system as something close to grace. Prescott made a sound he would not have made in any other context and sat down on the stone floor because his legs had made the decision for him, and Guthrie was shaking with the full-body tremors of a circulatory system reasserting itself after sustained thermal stress. Farrow sat against the east wall and closed his eyes. Marin worked without commentary. She knelt in front of Prescott first and removed his boots with the practiced efficiency of someone who has treated cold injuries and knows that speed matters more than gentleness at this stage. His toes were white to the second joint on 3 of them, which meant the tissue had been without circulation long enough to be at risk, but had not yet reached the stage where the damage was definitive. She packed his feet in dry cloth from a stack she had prepared and elevated them on the bench and moved to the next person. She checked Gerard's hands, which were the worst of the group. He had been digging longest and had lost sensation in the fingers of both hands before they found the door. She pressed the pads of his fingers firmly between her palms and held them, and the pain that came back with circulation was the clean pain of recovery rather than the dull pain of loss, which was the distinction that mattered. She said nothing while she worked. He said nothing either. The space between them held what both of them knew without requiring it to be spoken. Daniel had gone to the bench beside the small stove and sat with his knees up and his head back against the warm stone, and his eyes open, staring at the angle of the glazed roof above him, where the storm light, gray and violent, pressed against the outside of the glass without entering. She went to him last and put the back of her hand against his forehead, and whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her because she moved to the pot on the stove and began ladling soup into cups. When everyone had been assessed and attended to and was holding something warm in their hands, she sat down on the bench at the stove end and looked at them, 5 men in various states of recovered and recovering, filling a space that was not large, surrounded by the evidence of 6 weeks of solitary work and 35 years of solitary knowledge. She was 62 years old, and she had not slept more than 5 hours in any night since the storm began, sleeping lightly against the possibility of exactly what had just happened. And the tiredness was in her face in the way that tiredness lives in the faces of people who have been managing it rather than surrendering to it. Prescott looked at her over the edge of his cup. His face had changed from what it had been at the town meeting in ways that went beyond the physical damage of 2 hours in the cold. Something had been removed from it, not just the authority which had been a performance anyway, but the layer beneath the authority, the certainty that had been the foundation for the performance. What was left was a face that looked like it had recently been introduced to itself for the first time. I believed, he said, his voice roughened from the cold and something else, that I was protecting people. That is what I told myself. He looked into the cup rather than at her. That what I was doing at that meeting was the responsible action of a man with experience and judgment. That your proposal was the thing that needed to be examined for flaws. Marin waited. I was protecting myself. He said it simply without the performance of self-flagellation, which was the form of honesty she found most credible. My position, my certainty. I couldn't afford for you to be right because if you were right, then everything I'd been confident about for 15 years was open to question. And I couldn't sit with that. He finally looked at her. I understand the difference now between those two things, between protecting people and protecting your own certainty. The cost of the confusion turned out to be significant. The storm pressed against the glass above them with the indifference of weather that does not adjust itself to the narratives of the people caught inside it. She said, I didn't come to that meeting to embarrass you. I came because I knew what was coming and I knew what needed to be built. That's all it was. I know that now. He paused. I knew it then too, somewhere underneath everything else. That was the part I couldn't tolerate. She accepted this without softening it and without adding to it because it was complete as stated, and any addition would have been something other than honesty. Over the following days, the shelter held what it had been built to hold, which was not just temperature, but the specific combination of conditions: breathable air, manageable humidity, sufficient light through the glass during the short December daylight hours that allowed human beings to function rather than merely survive. The ventilation system worked exactly as she had calculated, maintaining air quality for 13 people in a space designed for one without the buildup of moisture and carbon dioxide that would otherwise have made the shelter unlivable within 48 hours. She explained this to them on the second day when Daniel asked why the air felt clean, holding a strip of cloth near the floor intake to show the movement of air entering, then moving his hand to the exhaust pipe at the ceiling to show the movement leaving. You're not in a sealed space, she told them. You're in a space that breathes. The earth outside pre-warms the incoming air, so you're not constantly fighting to heat what comes in. The warm air you generate rises and leaves at the pump, and the replacement comes in at the bottom already warmer than outside. The system is self-regulating. It doesn't require anything from you except that you don't block the pipes. Guthrie, who had been a farmer for 30 years and had a farmer's practical relationship with physical systems, looked at the floor intake for a long moment. How did you know this would work? My mother built one in 1839. It worked. The physics didn't change between 1839 and now. It was not a complicated answer, but it had the quality of answers that come from the intersection of theoretical knowledge and witnessed evidence, and it carried the authority that that intersection produced. Guthrie nodded slowly, the nod of a man updating a long-held assumption, and did not ask further questions. The seventh person arrived on the second night, Prescott's daughter-in-law navigating the tunnel with his granddaughter on her back, guided to the slope by Pharaoh, who had recovered enough to make the return trip with a rope tied between them and a specific route memorized from the outbound journey. The child, 7 years old and frightened past the point of crying, was placed directly on the warm stone bench and given soup and did not speak for several hours. When she did speak, she asked if the house in the ground was going to fall down, and Marin told her that houses built the right way did not fall down, and that this was a house built the right way, and the child accepted this with the empirical directness of a child who has recently been given a great deal of reason to prefer truth over reassurance. 6 more people came over the following 3 days in pairs and small groups guided by the rope system that Daniel organized and maintained with the methodical competence he applied to everything, the total rising to 13, the space growing dense and warm, with the particular intimacy of people who have stopped performing for each other because the performance has become too expensive to maintain. Marin rationed the food with a firmness that nobody challenged because the logic was visible and the alternative was visible, and people who can see the logic clearly don't usually argue with it. Silas Holt arrived on the 5th day of the storm. He came alone, which was the detail that surprised her, not because she had expected him to come with someone else, but because she had expected, if he came at all, that his arrival would be accompanied by some preparatory construction, an explanation, a justification, something that allowed him to present himself as a person arriving rather than a person being delivered. He had none of that. He knocked once and stood in the tunnel entrance when she opened the door with the expression of a man who has used up everything he had in getting here and has nothing left for the presentation. His face was frost-damaged across both cheeks, and his hands, when she looked at them, had been borderline frostbitten and partially recovered, suggesting he had started toward the slope and retreated and started again more than once before completing the journey. She stepped back to let him in. He came through the door and stood in the space and did not speak. Gerard was sitting on the bench against the east wall and looked up when his father entered. The look that passed between them was the compressed communication of people who know each other too well for words to carry the primary information. Silas looked at his son and saw something that had changed something in the way Gerard was sitting in this space, not as a visitor or a prisoner, but as a person who understood where he was and had made a decision about it. Silas looked away first. Marin handed him a cup without ceremony. He took it. She said, not unkindly but without modulation, "You are not welcomed here, and you are not turned away. You are permitted in because everyone is permitted in." She looked at him evenly. "That is the difference. I want you to understand it." He understood it. You could see that he understood it in the way he sat down, not with relief exactly, but with the diminished posture of a man who has received exactly what he deserved rather than what he hoped for and has recognized the justice of it. He sat on the floor near the door away from the others and held his cup and was quiet. On the sixth day, during the long hours when the storm still held, and the light through the glass was the flat gray of sustained cloud cover, Reverend Crane sat beside Marin on the bench with his hands folded in his lap and was quiet for a long time before he spoke. He had been the quietest of the group since arriving, which was a notable change in a man whose professional function was speech, and she had watched him be quiet and had not disturbed it because she recognized it as a productive quiet, the kind that is doing work. "I owe you an apology that I am not certain how to give correctly," he said. The precision was genuine, she could hear that. "I used language from my tradition to dismiss something I didn't understand, and I used it in public, which amplified the dismissal. The language was the wrong tool. The knowledge you were offering had nothing to do with faith in either direction. It was simply knowledge, and I dressed it in a category that let me not engage with it." She considered this for a moment. "What would you have done differently?" "I would have been quiet." He said it with the weight of a man for whom quiet represented a significant sacrifice. "I would have said, 'I don't understand this,' and asked you to explain it further. I had the opportunity to do that. I chose performance instead." He looked at his hands. 17 people would still be alive if enough of us had chosen differently that night. The number had arrived the previous day, counted by Daniel on his circuit of the town, 17 dead distributed across the same demographic her mother could have predicted without knowing the town at all. The very old who lived alone, the households on the exposed edges of the settlement, the families whose wood supply had run out before the storm's third day. Each death was a specific person with a specific name, and Daniel had spoken the names quietly when he reported the number, which was the correct way to say a number that was also 17 human beings. She had not cried when she heard the number. She had sat with it in the silence of someone who had done everything available to them to make the number different and had not been allowed to do the available things. That was a different grief than the grief of failure, and it was not lighter, but it was clean in a way that failure was not. "The knowledge came from my mother," she told Crane, "and from her mother before her. It was tested over generations in conditions very much like this one. I carried it for 35 years and said nothing because I had learned that the source of the knowledge made people unwilling to receive it. That was a calculation I made for self-protection, and I do not entirely fault myself for it." She paused. "But I should have spoken sooner. That is also true." Crane looked at her. "You tried. At the meeting." "I tried once at one meeting in October. I had known about this knowledge my entire life, and I had never once attempted to share it with this community. One meeting in October was not the full measure of what was possible." She looked at the glazed roof where the storm was conducting its seventh day of sustained argument with the structure and losing. I own that part of it. The storm broke on the morning of December 25th, which was a date that no one mentioned for its symbolic content because there was too much actual content to manage. The wind stopped first, not gradually, but in one discrete moment, as if a decision had been made, and the silence that followed had the quality of something very loud ceasing rather than the ordinary quiet of an undisturbed morning. Then the sky began to change, the cloud mass moving south with the speed of something that had completed its purpose and was leaving. Marin went out first alone, climbing through the tunnel they had maintained across 7 days of occupation, emerging into a world that had been remade so completely that the process of recognizing familiar landmarks required a full minute of standing and looking. The snow was shaped into forms that had the abstract quality of a landscape that had never contained human habitation. 20-foot drifts, sculpted by sustained directional wind into curves and overhangs that would have been beautiful if they had not been the direct physical record of the force that had killed 17 people. The town below was not visible as a town. It was visible as a set of geometric shapes interrupting the smooth surface of the snow, some of them still recognizable as rooflines, others buried to their peaks. The sun was out, thin and pale and precisely positioned. It was past the winter solstice now, and the arc of its transit across the sky was at its lowest, and the light it produced had the quality of light that is doing its best rather than light that is sufficient. It hit the glazed roof panel behind her, and she could feel, even standing in the open air, the warmth coming off the glass that had been collecting solar gain since the angle of the sun had cleared the ridge an hour before. She stood in the cold and breathed it, not the iron and stone smell of the approaching storm, but the clean mineral cold of aftermath air scoured to its simplest components. She breathed it and let it fill her lungs completely, and breathed it out and felt the completeness of having been right about the most important thing she had ever been right about, and also the weight that being right in this particular way always carried the weight of the 17 names on the other side of the calculation. The search began that morning. They organized in the way that Daniel organized things, which was to say clearly and without wasted motion, dividing the town into sections and moving through them systematically, calling out at each door before forcing it if the calling produced no response. Most houses produced survivors, cold-depleted, frightened people who had made it through by burning furniture and wearing everything they own and sleeping in human piles for shared warmth. The losses were concentrated in the places the data had suggested they would be concentrated, and each one was a name rather than a statistic. And Daniel recorded the names in his notebook with the care of someone who understands that bearing witness is also a form of action. The O'Connell house was the one that settled most heavily. The family had been together, that was clear from the arrangement, not collapsed where they stood, but gathered, positioned, as though the last thing they had done deliberately was move toward each other. Prescott stood outside the door for a long time before he went in, and when he came out, his face had been simplified further. The remaining performance burned away, leaving something that was not grief exactly, but the particular expression of a man who has looked directly at the consequence of his choices and has stopped finding ways to put something between himself and the looking. The assessment of Holt's wood supply emerged not through accusation, but through the accumulation of consistent observation. Daniel had been noting the burn rates and residue characteristics of the houses that had failed earliest, and the pattern was clear to anyone with the technical vocabulary to read it. Green timber, high moisture content, rapid initial combustion, followed by slow, smoldering net heat output per cord, significantly below what seasoned hardwood produced. He wrote it all in his notebook and left the notebook on the table in the town hall without saying anything to Holt directly, which was a form of communication that required no interpretation. Holt read the notebook. Prescott read it. The community read it in the way communities read things that are left in accessible places, not all at once, and not officially, but thoroughly. Holt did not deny any of it. He did not construct an explanation or a defense. He went to each of the houses where someone had died and stood outside for a while, and whether this was penance or something more functional than penance was between him and whatever he believed about accountability, and the town did not press him on it because the town was too busy surviving to invest energy in prosecution. The accounting would happen inside him, or it would not happen, and the result of that internal process would eventually be visible in his actions, and that would be the measure of it. Gerard came to her on the third day after the storm broke, finding her at the shelter where she was conducting a structural assessment, checking the mortar joints for frost damage, examining the ventilation pipes for any compromise from the accumulated weight of the drift. He stood at the edge of the excavated area and watched her work for a moment before she acknowledged him, not because she hadn't heard him arrive, but because she was finishing a section of inspection that required complete attention. She looked up at him. He had his father's build and his own face, which was currently carrying the particular expression of someone who has been constructing a sentence for several days. "I knew in November," he said. "I stood on this slope and I ran the calculations, and I knew this would work exactly as you described. And I went home and told my father it was sound, and he told me not to say that to anyone, and I didn't." He paused. 17 people. She set down the tool she had been using and looked at him directly. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because someone should know. Because Emmett Shaw knew and stayed quiet and died with it in his hand, and I have spent 8 days understanding that I was doing the same thing on a longer timeline." He met her eyes without looking away. "I don't know if there is anything useful in the telling at this point. I'm not asking for absolution. I'm asking to be known accurately." She considered this for a moment, the wind moving lightly around them in the thin winter sunlight, the temperature still well below freezing, but holding nothing of the storm's terminal quality, just ordinary cold, the kind that told you to dress appropriately, rather than the kind that told you nothing because there was no appropriate dress. "Your knowledge could have changed what happened," she said, "if you had spoken at that meeting." "That is true. It is also true that you were 28 years old and afraid of your father and living inside a system of authority that you had been trained since childhood to treat as the natural order of things. Both of those things are true at the same time." She picked up her tool again. "What you do with the knowing going forward is the part that matters now." He stood there for another moment, absorbing this, and then he asked if he could help with the inspection, and she handed him the rod she used for testing mortar integrity and showed him what she was looking for, and they worked through the afternoon without needing to resolve anything further between them. The Springtown meeting was held in the first week of March, when the last of the major drifts had reduced themselves to stubborn remnants in the deep shadows of the north-facing buildings, and the ground had begun to produce the specific mud that Dakota Territory produced in March. Purposeful mud, committed mud, the kind that meant the earth was coming back to itself. The hall smelled of wood smoke and the beginning of something else, a slight earthen quality in the air that was the ground thawing below the floorboards, the building reconnecting to the land beneath it. Prescott stood at the front of the room as he had stood there dozens of times before, but the way he occupied the space was different now. Less proprietorial, the posture of someone who has relinquished something large and is still learning to stand without the weight of it. His face was thinner. The frost damage on his cheekbones had healed cleanly. He said, "We built a town on the assumption that confidence was the same as competence, and that experience of the ordinary was preparation for the extraordinary, and that wisdom could be dismissed on the basis of its source. Every one of those assumptions turned out to be wrong in ways that we paid for with the names of 17 people who trusted us to make sound decisions." He stopped and let the room carry the silence for a moment, rather than filling it immediately, which was a change from the man who had filled every silence at every previous meeting. "I was wrong. I was specifically and consequentially wrong. And the form my wrongness took was the refusal to hear what a person was telling me because I was more committed to my own certainty than to the truth she was offering." He turned and looked directly at Marin, who was sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and when he looked at her, there was no performance in it, no orchestrated humility, no public theater of contrition. Just a man looking at a woman who had been correct in every material particular and communicating the full acknowledgement of that without dressing it in anything else. "Mistress Calloway, this town asks your forgiveness, knowing it has not earned it and may not earn it. This town asks your guidance, knowing it refused it when it was offered freely. We ask you to teach us not because we deserve the teaching, but because the alternative is to remain what we were, and what we were was not enough to protect the people in our care." Marin did not respond immediately. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she looked at the room at Holt sitting near the back, with his hands on his knees, at Gerard beside him, at Daniel Webb, with his notebook, at Martha Finney, who had come to every meeting but never spoken, at Reverend Crane, with his narrow face wearing its new expression of instructed humility, at the survivors who had spent 7 days in the earth with her and carried it differently now than they carried ordinary experience. She said, "I will teach, on the condition that what gets built belongs to everyone, not to me. The knowledge is not mine, it came from my mother and from her people, and the only thing I did was carry it and use it when it was needed. Whatever we build here, we build in that name." Prescott nodded. He picked up the pen from the table and wrote what she had said, and then he said, "What name, Evening Star Calloway?" She said it without particular emotion, the way you say the name of someone who is present in everything around you, even when they are not present in the room. That is the name this work should carry forward. The summer of 1877 was the most physically productive period in the history of Harrow's Crossing, and also the most complicated. The digging happened simultaneously with the grief of the previous winter, the two processes running alongside each other, the way grief and work always run alongside each other when the work is necessary and the grief is real. They dug on the south-facing slope of the same ridge where Marin's shelter sat, extending and expanding the design into a communal structure large enough to hold every remaining resident of the town in survivable conditions. And they dug with a purposefulness that was not the same as enthusiasm, but was more durable. The purposefulness of people who understand precisely what they are preventing. Marin directed from the ground level, which was where direction of this kind needed to happen. She walked the excavation each morning before work began and each evening after it ended, checking the progress of the walls, the positioning of the drainage channels, the angle calculations for the expanded glazing system. She answered questions with the patience of someone who understands that transferring knowledge requires repetition at the receiver's pace rather than the teacher's. And she never answered a question with impatience, even when the question was one she had answered before, because the asking was always coming from a different place than the previous asking. Gerard worked beside her in the technical capacity, which was an arrangement that had produced some comment in the first week, and then had stopped producing comment because the work it produced was visibly superior to what either of them could have produced separately. He had a precision in his calculations that complemented her empirical knowledge, and she had decades of tested application that kept his calculations honest. The conversation between them was the conversation between theory and practice, and it produced structures that held both. Daniel recorded everything in his notebooks, which were filling up with dimension sketches and material specifications, and the kind of detailed documentation that allowed knowledge to survive the people who carried it. Silas Holt worked on the labor crews hauling stone and mixing mortar, and doing the kind of sustained physical work that he had not done personally for many years. He worked without complaint and without seeking recognition for the working, which was appropriate since the recognition was not available, and he knew it. His presence on the crews was a form of restitution that could not be completed, but could be continued indefinitely, and he seemed to understand this, that he was not working toward a moment when the account was settled, but toward a way of living with an account that would not settle. Gerard watched his father work and said nothing about it, which was its own kind of communication. On a Thursday evening in the middle of August, Marin stood at the crest of the hill as the light was going and looked at what they had built. The communal shelter was 300 feet long on its east-west axis, set into the slope at the same angle as her original design, with the expanded glazing system covering the full south face in the amber light of a setting summer sun. The pipes emerged from the earthen roof in a row, neat and functional, the only visible indication of the mechanical sophistication contained in what looked from a distance like a natural feature of the hillside. The earth that covered the structure had already begun to grow grass in the sections where they had seeded it, and by next summer it would be indistinguishable from the slope itself, a building that had become part of the land that held it. She sat down on the crest with her hands flat on the cooling earth behind her, feeling through her palms the temperature of the ground still warm from the day the surface holding the sun's investment, the way it always had not, because it had been asked to, or because it was performing any function beyond its own nature, but because that was what the earth did. It received what was given and held it and gave it back slowly, without drama, without announcement across the hours and days and seasons in which human beings were doing the more obviously significant work of being alive above it. She thought about her mother on the hill in 1839, choosing the spot for the shelter, not this hill, but a hill with the same physics, the same relationship between the angle of the slope and the angle of the winter sun, the same dense clay that would accept the excavation and hold its shape. Her mother had walked that hill the same way Marin had walked this one, reading it through her feet and her hands in the particular intelligence of someone who had been taught by people who had been taught by people who had learned these things through the unforgiving methodology of necessity. The knowledge was not ancient in the way that ancient was sometimes used to mean primitive. It was ancient in the way that physics was ancient, tested across generations, until the things that worked had been kept and the things that didn't had been set aside, leaving a practice that was as close to reliable as human knowledge ever got. 35 years of silence, and then one October meeting, and then this hill on an August evening with the grass growing over the roof of something that would keep people alive when the next storm came. Because the next storm would come. The sky did not negotiate and the cold did not make exceptions, and the people of Harrow's Crossing had learned this in the most expensive way that lessons could be purchased, and the learning had cost them 17 names and the certainty of men who had confused their confidence for the truth. She did not know if she had forgiven them. Forgiveness was a process rather than a decision, and she was somewhere in the middle of it, in the way that you were always somewhere in the middle of a process that didn't have a clean ending. What she knew was that the work was right, and that the work belonged to more people than she had expected to share it with, and that her mother's name was on the cornerstone of the communal shelter in letters that Daniel Webb had carved, with more care than the work strictly required, the care of someone who understood that names carved in stone were a form of argument against forgetting. She pressed her palms harder against the earth. The warmth came back through her hands, patient and steady, the way warmth always came from the earth. Not quickly, not dramatically, not in the sudden burst of a fire built against the cold, but continuously from the vast, slow reserve of everything the ground had accepted and held. You had to be willing to be still to receive it. You had to be willing to put your hands down and wait. The sun finished its descent behind the ridge to the west, and the sky went through its sequence of colors the way it always did, indifferent to the fact that there were people below watching it happen, doing what it did because it was what it did, because there was no version of the sky that didn't produce this particular sequence at this particular hour. Marin stated until the stars came out. She had named 17 of them in the weeks after the storm, moving through the winter sky with her eyes and her memory, and the knowledge that naming was what you did when you could not do anything else, when the storm had passed and the decisions were made and the consequences were what they were, and all that remained was to remember correctly. She had named a different star for each person, not in any system her mother would have recognized, but in the private system of someone who needed the dead to have addresses. She found them one by one in the August sky, the winter constellations not yet risen, their addresses still below the horizon, the stars themselves unchanged and entirely uninformed about the small human drama that had assigned them these responsibilities. She sat with them for a while, the earth warm beneath her, the shelter below her, doing what it had been built to do. Then she got up and walked down the hill in the dark, steady on the ground she knew.